Hello, hello, humans, and welcome back to the Drop Kennel podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by the letter E, and this one might get a little spicy behind the old eyeballs for some. So please be sure you check in with yourself before listening on, because today we are talking about euthanasia, and we're not going to talk about any other topics. There are going to be a couple thematic terms that come up that also happen to start with the letter E, but we are focused solely on euthanasia today. Because this is a deeply sensitive subject, please, I really ask that you do a quick body scan, kind of check in with yourself, and make sure you're in an open mindset before you listen on. I want to waste as little time as we can on chit chat today, so we're gonna jump right in, y'all. The definition of euthanasia is the practice of humanely ending an animal's life without causing pain or distress. The term comes from the Greek words EU, meaning good, and thanatos, or thanos, meaning death. So again, that means good death. For the remainder of the podcast, I will be referring to euthanasia as EUs. That's the terminology we use in shelters as well as in vet med. So we are going to stick with that language. So I always remember my interview with the shelter that I worked at. So coming from the beauty industry, making a huge career shift and going into make, I think at that time it was maybe $10.75 an hour. And sitting down in my interview, and the first question was unabashedly asked what my personal position was in regards to euthanasia, which should be the first question asked in any shelter position interview, if you ask me. I think it's a really important thing to make known before anyone chooses to work in this industry, because it is prevalent regardless of what type of shelter or rescue or sanctuary you are in. So at the time of my interview, I didn't know truthfully what my position was. I never gave it a ton of thought because I didn't need to. I know that growing up, we euthanized my family dogs in our home with a professional. The first was Maggie. I was young. I think I was maybe under the age of 10. No, maybe I was older. I have a horrible memory in general, but especially trying to recall things from childhood. My memory, I don't know where it goes. So I can't recall exactly how old I was, but I was young. So the first dog was Maggie. She was a Bashan who lived a full, happy life until she could no longer do so without pain. So we euthanized her in the home, and that was my first true experience with death in general. So then there was Cougar and Hallie. They were dogs that we bought from a breeder. They were Bashans as well. Those were our family kind of familiars that we had. And they came into our lives when I was in high school. So they both lived long and healthy lives. They both started to decline in their mid to late teens. They lived a very long time. So at that point, I was in my 20s when we decided as a family to have them both go on their universal journey together. They were litter mates. They came into this world together, and we wanted them to exit this world together. That was my only experience really with euthanasia. I knew that during each process with my family pets that I wanted to be there and witness the process. I do remember growing up that I actually had, and still to this day have, a very deep fascination around death. I was bullied for it pretty mercilessly in middle school. But it's something that has always fascinated me because it is the one thing that we all absolutely have to do. But when it came to this process within sheltering, I didn't know. I didn't have experience other than my family pets to draw a position from. So when it came to applying that little experience I had with it as a child and a young adult, I knew that it freed my beloved dogs from pain when it was their time. I never gave it much more thought than that until now, sitting in that interview. So fast forward to me landing at the shelter and being met with EU's what felt like a freight train, kind of coming in hot. I found myself struggling for sure, but I did quickly form an initial position in regards to EU's in the shelter. And we'll get to that a little later on in today's episode. But first, I want to have this conversation having as much information around sheltering as we can, which means we have to define a few things. So the first thing we need to define is no kill. So no kill is defined in shelters as a policy in shelters in which animals will not be euthanized for space or due to length of stay. This term, no kill, has become such a hot button item in the last 2 or 3 decades. It's become a philosophy for many shelters who have the capacity for care to follow it. And there's, a lot to be said about it. And it reminds me of when I did first start working at the shelter, and I was talking with a friend that I got hired with this shelter, and she so quickly stated that she'll never support that shelter. They say they're no kill, but they kill animals. And I was like, oh, can you elaborate a little bit? Because I was really. Hi, Delilah. As per usual, Delilah's letting it be known that she is here. Chloe's here too, but she's a quiet lady. But I remember her saying that, and I asked her to elaborate, and she said, well, I'm only going to support the other shelter that's outside of our county that's about 2 hours away up north. And I said, okay, well, why? So she said, they don't kill their animals. And I asked her what information she was basing that off of. And she started talking about this other shelter and how they, were the underdogs of what she saw as appropriate sheltering, which was having a lot of barriers and hurdles to leap over in order to even adopt, having to have, like basically a background check and character witnesses from a vet that knows you in order to adopt an animal. And she said that they truly are no kill, that they'll adopt out anything. And I remember, again, this was early on in my career. This was probably within the first 6 months of me working there. And I was so taken aback by it because I immediately knew that that wasn't true. I also immediately knew that we just took animals from that shelter that had huge behavioral issues because they didn't want to make the call on euthanasia. They made it our problem, knowing full well that we were more than likely going to euthanize a couple of the animals based on their behavior. So I want the no kill aspect to be as clear as crystal, as clear as we can get it without any subjective connections to it, which is really hard to do because it is. There's no like rhyme or reason as to why. It just is. It's very difficult to grasp. So when we're defining no kill, what we're really looking at is statistics. So let's look at a more statistical definition of what no kill means. And hopefully this helps that one friend of mine understand it, because at the time I didn't have the experience or the language to help explain what she was feeling and help explain why that position just simply wasn't true. So, by the way, we had a higher live release rate than this shelter. So, there's that. But it's all about marketing, I guess. So let's really look at this statistical definition of no kill as well. So we are looking at most shelters, whether they're open admission or not, having a goal of a 90 to a 95% save rate each year, meaning 90 to 95% of their population make it out of the doors alive. That leaves a 5 to 10% population to be met with unexpected death, whether that be medical or with euthanasia. So that's that statistical definition. And that's where, if you support one shelter and you are under the impression based off of their marketing or whatever it is, or just stories that you hear about them through word of mouth, um, I can promise you that all shelters who are saying no kill does not mean that they do not kill a single animal or euthanize a single animal. It means they stay within this range of 90 to 95% live release. I want that to be very, very clear because, again, this no kill topic gets very convoluted with subjective and emotional opinion, more often than not from those who don't even work in sheltering, but have access to the internet and TikTok, and like to talk about it. Anyway, that's that. So we have that definition of no kill now. So let's talk about how that reaches different types of agencies or shelters or organizations that are here to help our homeless pet population. So, like I said, we've got the no kill. And then we've got our kill shelters or our high kill shelters. These are shelters that have an open admissions policy more often than not, meaning they'll accept any animal regardless of medical or behavioral background, age, etc. Essentially, there's no restrictions on what they'll accept. These shelters tend to be in a higher populated area within our country. So a lot of coastal cities, a lot of more urban cities with a higher population of people. That only makes sense that your homeless pet population is going to match the amount of people in that sort of numbers way. So these shelters do their best by the fucking skin of their teeth. Their best may not match your definition of your best, but they are there for a purpose and they're trying. But that definitely gets us into a gray territory, especially when we talk about euthanasia and when we talk about policy, and definitely when we get into a discussion about ethics, right? So these shelters, these kill shelters, high kill shelters are met with, I don't know if they have weekly outcome meetings or if they have daily ones. It probably depends on their population. But when that happens, when they're trying to keep their heads above water, that often leads to EUs for additional space based off of what animals have been in their population for the longest. So this is where you'll find a lot of, independently led groups or even just single individuals trying to transport animals on the EU list anywhere they can to save their lives. We see a lot of those pleas on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, all over social media, which is always obviously in good faith. We want to save as many as we can, but I will tell you all right now, I am not of the save them all philosophy. I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think that's fair to the people in sheltering. I think for me personally, when it would come to people in our community wanting to transfer animals from high kill shelters from other states into our shelter, we can't do that. You're crossing state lines. We don't know if there's an outbreak of disease in that place. We don't know the behavioral well-being of these animals. And we have animals in our own community to continue to serve as we've promised to do. So I know it's an uncomfortable opinion for some of you to hear, but that is how I feel. This last year, we had a woman bring us a few dogs from a high kill shelter in LA, and she really worked hard on manipulating the background and the story of these animals in order to get them out of the kill shelter into ours and into our adoption population. And we typically take dogs from our transfer programs. A lot of them are from reservations around the state, and that's our focus. That's the hill we chose and choose to stand on, is within our in-state community. So long story short, this woman somehow kind of evades our senses, and certainly plays into our love of animals and brings us, I think it was about 3 dogs, who she rescued and ended up not keeping herself and made it kind of look like an owner surrender, although she had zero information on these animals. What she did know about one is that this one dog, who was probably about 6, was in a shelter for anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So that's the majority of her life. The whole thing just didn't feel good to me. Um, and one of those dogs proved to be quite intense with other dogs and people. She was inevitably EU'd due to being a safety risk for our own community, after showing us that she had a very difficult time recovering in a home environment. We sent her out to a sleepover, and that was a lot for her. She hadn't even gotten into the door of the home that she was going to have a sleepover on so we could get more information on her before she attacked the husband. And there was a little kid around and close to being bit as well, and another dog. She, was brought back immediately. The attack on the husband did require medical assistance, and we have zero history on this dog. And it was, for us, unanimous that this wasn't a dog that we could safely place within our community. So that's why I tend to be a little more, I guess, touchy on independent people or independent, smaller groups going in and pulling from the EU list. Yes, we want to get good dogs out and give them a happy life. However, if you're inundating other shelters throughout the country with these dogs, you're then taking away from that community. And that's where I kind of have a bit of an issue with it. So with that said, let's keep going. So that was kind of an overview of those high kill shelters. We've got rescues as well. A lot of rescues are foster based, and a lot of them are also breed specific. So I think rescuing and sheltering can be kind of synonymous within each other. But for all intents and purposes, rescues are different from animal shelters. Rescues tend to be, like I said, foster based and a lot of time breed specific, and they work heavily with digital outposts. So they utilize social media to get these animals into official homes. So there's not really a brick and mortar location. Whoever runs the rescue may have the space and ability in their home to house at least maybe 10 dogs, and hopefully they have the proper licensing to do that. So these can range from organized nonprofits to that sort of mom and pop type of rescue. We see a lot of overcrowding in the mom and pop type rescues. So again, those people who will take on as many as they can, even like this woman who brought us the 3 dogs from LA, only to realize, like, oh shit, I have my own dogs and I can't also house these 3 dogs. They're squabbling and this isn't feasible. So let's make it the shelter's problem. And that's where those mom and pop rescues can get a little hairy. And that's when we start seeing them pop up on the ASPCA or HSUS radar of, is there cruelty involved? By way of happenstance of you trying to do the right thing, of course. So those ones are very interesting to observe as well. I also find that, similar to the shelter that my friend referred to that, would never kill an animal, have rigorous adoption processes. And that's not fair to the dog or the cat. If you're going to hang on to these animals for dear life until you get that perfect home with that perfect environment, you're going to be waiting a real fucking long time. And then you're going to contribute to deterioration, like we talked about the other week. And you're going to contribute to a lack of capacity for care within your own rescue. So those are things that I think are really important to think about. And these are those types of situations where you really do want to observe all perspectives and then come to your own opinion about them. So that's how I came to my opinion about these things. So, like I said, we've got our no kill, we've got our high kill, we've got rescues, and we also have sanctuaries. So Best Friends Animal Sanctuary is probably the most recognizable name in sanctuary, one of the largest ones for companion pets that I can think of. And their goal is essentially to obliterate high kill shelters and streamline the term and practice of no kill as well. Their position is in line with the current statistical definition of no kill, meaning that, let's stay within that 10% of any animal population within the shelter may be subject to humane end. And let's focus on that 90 to 95% live release rate. But sanctuaries, by definition, it's a facility where animals are brought to live and be protected for the rest of their lives. Uh, my position on that is similar to my position on some rescues, and briefly touches upon that save them all mentality. I don't necessarily agree with sending a highly dog aggressive dog to sanctuary so it can live in a semi shelter setting surrounded by other dogs. That is like the biggest nightmare of immersion therapy I could think of. So that's, my take. Again, not the most popular opinion, or it might be. I don't know. I don't think we talk about this enough in shelters about like where our positions are with these types of facilities. Um, so I think it's important to think about. So, with that said, we've got all these other types of agencies and pop-up sheltering practices, but these three that I mentioned, the no kill, the high kill, well, I guess four I can count, and rescue and sanctuary are the ones that I kind of like to speak about when we're talking about euthanasia. That way we know, and you guys have an understanding that when you do have your outcomes meeting within a shelter setting, that you've looked into all of these other possibilities for this animal before deciding to move forward with euthanasia. So keep that in mind. So we've got that groundwork sort of covered. A little bit of a surface, exploration of these tools that can be used when you're making your choice in a shelter for euthanasia. So let's go back. Going back in time to the beginning of my career. I quickly learned that there were different kind of types or criteria for EUs, meaning that, the two base criteria is medical or behavioral. So those are kind of the umbrella labels for what is discussed in these outcome meetings. There are other topics to speak about when making these decisions. Like I said, that's okay. Can we try a rescue? Can we try transferring to another shelter within our community? Can we send it to sanctuary? Does it qualify? There's criteria for all of these things, mind you. You can't just say, hey, best friends, here's this animal. They have criteria too, just like we do in a shelter. So keep that in mind. So those are other topics discussed, and some of those are also topics of quality of life, safety. Does the unicorn home exist for this specific pet? And if so, how long is it going to take them to find it, us, and the animal? And then you also talk about, are there genetic things going on with the animal that could be contributing to the medical or the behavioral issues that have landed this animal in the outcomes meeting? Not every animal in the building, I should say, gets discussed on an outcome platform. It is only animals who present medical or behavioral issues that could not fit the adoptability criteria, just as a heads up. So those are the things that, we talk about a lot when we do have our stack of files, or sometimes no files on a good week when we bring these animals to discussion or the outcomes meeting. So while I was gathering my thoughts, for this episode, I did a quick little dive into the history of euthanasia, into EUs, and what I found was not news to me, but might be news to you. And I thought it was a fun tidbit to share before we get into the kind of nitty gritty of what's happening in modern day times in sheltering. And that's, historically speaking, the kind of first proof that we have been euthanizing our pets comes from ancient Egypt. So oftentimes, there was this religious or spiritual practice that people would be buried with their pets. So at one human's untimely or timely or expected death, if they had a pet, that pet would be euthanized in order to be buried with its person. A lot of that comes from spiritual and religious beliefs of having your familiar, as I refer to them, accompany you into the afterlife. So that's kind of our first known, through anthropological studies, of proof that we've been doing this as humans. We have been euthanizing our pets for a long time. There's probably more evidence before ancient Egypt that has yet to present itself. Who knows? I certainly don't because I'm not a scientist, but boy, do I find it fascinating. So you're in ancient Egypt, you die, and whoever your next of kin is knows that the next order is to euthanize your pet and bury them with you. Um, and it's such a pivotal piece of history to kind of quantify our own modern day kind of ethics around EUs. And that does bring me to the other two kind of terms that will be popping up throughout the rest of the episode, and that's ethics and ego. That all just happen to start with the letter E. Love how that works out. Let's move forward now with the process of EUs in a shelter. They are the same that you would experience with vet med, whether you take your pet to the vet to be euthanized when it's their time, or you utilize a in-home end-of-life veterinarian who comes to you and, excuse me, euthanizes your pet in your home. So the process, and if for anyone sensitive to this type of language, maybe hit mute for the next, I don't know, minute. The animal is first injected with a sedative that will allow for them to feel nothing once the euthanasia drug is administered. The sedative is typically administered through an injection intramuscular, sometimes, depending on the situation or the breed. It can be subcutaneous as well, so right under the skin versus into the muscle. Sometimes we'll also use like I call it, or pre sedation, where we do an oral sedative, and that is dependent on what the animal's need would be to feel as safe and stress-free as possible. I am not a vet, and I'm not comfortable saying what drugs we use. I don't think I have the qualifications to discuss that. So I'm going to err on the side of caution and just let you know that we use certain drugs. We call it a chill pill at our shelter. That we administer orally if we think it's necessary based on the animal's behavior, and then we do the injection sedative, and then we do the euthanasia drug. The euthanasia drug is administered typically in the vein, depending on the pet or the animal. It could be through the stomach as well. Through the stomach is done. IP is the abbreviation with kittens often, because you can't find a vein in little kitties. But that's the process. Once you start injecting into the vein, I was taught to always go quite slow with the injection so that by the time I'm done injecting, the animal has already left us, or is at least very well on their way. So that's the process. In sheltering, many staff members can obtain their CET, which is known as a Certified Euthanasia Technician license, without medical background. So sheltering has a few kind of allowances like that in order to maintain structure and consistency within their walls. You do have to take a class and obtain certification through the state board in order to do so. And you must pass, I think they do a series of background checks, and need to be in good standing at your place of work, as well as just within your community. So in the shelter I worked at, we had a large group of staff that wanted to get certified. There was a monetary incentive for doing so. You would get a raise, and I think it was 25 cents at the time. And that, anyone who works in sheltering knows that you'll take any sort of raise you can get, because we do not get paid a lot. So that did allow us at our shelter, though, to have a schedule, meaning if there were 10 of us with our CET, and that includes the vet clinic as well, that we would alternate weeks. So you could go 10 weeks before having to do a week of EUs. And then you would get 10 weeks, or 9, I guess, math, 9 weeks off of that. Didn't always work out that way, but that is certainly dependent upon the person. I myself am a people pleaser and have a hard time seeing other people struggle with euthanasia. So oftentimes I would step in and say, I'll do it. I've learned since then that was not healthy for me. But fuck, I can't help it. I am who I am. It's like Popeye says. But that schedule was really helpful. So shelters who maybe don't do that, I suggest looking into having a euthanasia schedule where Each week, it is up to one person to perform the euthanasias and their assistant. You always have to have two people there. And that way you can have a little bit of grace around the frequency in which someone is performing them. And that can help mitigate maybe some of that, staving off that, compassion fatigue. So this year, in 2024, according to Shelter Animals Count, which is a really cool organization. They've compiled data from shelters throughout the US, and I am happy to say that non-live release rates nationwide are down by 5% compared to 2023 and down 21% compared to 2019. That's huge. That is impressive. I'll link their mid-year report in the description so you can take a read. There's other data tidbits in there that are just really fascinating to look at. I do suggest anyone in sheltering checking out their reports, their beginning of year, mid-year, and end of year, because there are weeks where it'll feel like you have euthanized a lot of animals, even though it may be only 3. But it feels heavier because of whatever emotional connection you had to them. So a lot of times I would find it helpful looking at data and seeing that we're actually on track, if not leading, some of those data points within the nation for euthanasia and what live release versus non-live release rates look like. So that can be a helpful sort of analytic brain tool for those of you out there who might struggle with euthanasia and sheltering. And we all do, and that's okay. Before we move on, let's take a quick break before we get into more of the nitty-gritty of today's topic, where we talk about more of that ethical and ego aspect of euthanasia. I'll see you on the other side. Okay, welcome back. So earlier I mentioned the sort of umbrella curriculum to qualify an EU decision. So let's break down medical first. There are a few illnesses that would be considered what we would call an automatic EU on the medical end. So this is really important for anyone listening who might have a diabetic animal. In the shelter, in the event that caring for your diabetic animal becomes too much for you as the guardian, and you choose to surrender your pet to the shelter, this is almost always an automatic EU when it comes down to surrendering a diabetic animal. Why? Well, administering insulin to the pet, more often than not, in my experience, this has happened most with cats. But this procedure needs to run like clockwork and literally on the clock. Someone needs to be there to inject, let's say, at 8 a.m., which means someone needs to be there to inject at 8 p.m. Most shelters close between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. and don't have the funding for an overnight staff member. So the timing alone is not feasible in a shelter setting. We also have multiple, insulin checks and labs to run intermittently during the animal's stay that can decrease your capacity for care. Lastly, finding an adopter willing to take on a medical case can increase the animal's length of stay until that wonderful person shows up in the building. So there's a lot of variable and a lot of inability to provide for that animal in this example. So that adopter also may never show up. Cancer and all types of cancers are another type of medical issue we look at. At the shelter I was at, we were so freaking fortunate to have a facility that had an on-site clinic with full-time staff. So 2 vets and 3 vet techs. And that not all shelters have that I have beyond gratitude towards the medical staff that worked there, because had we not had that, I don't know. I don't know what the hell our capacity for care would have looked like. That ooh, I don't even want to think about it. So for those shelters out there who don't have on-site vet clinics, I applaud your work. That should be highlighted more, because you've got way more to manage offsite, and that's pretty incredible. So, with us though, we were at least really lucky to be able to diagnose and make really firm and informative decisions on a lot of medical cases. Then there's, of course, on the medical end, there's kitten season, which comes with the potential for failure to thrive, panleukopenia, and other illnesses that take a toll on these tiny little creatures in the shelter population. I can say that making the call on a kitten that's no more than 15 ounces in weight, who is failing, meaning not eating, not defecating, or having really nasty poops, they're dehydrated, they're unable to bounce back, which can happen whether it's in the shelter or in a foster home. It's not typically, obviously failure to thrive is heavier in the shelter setting, but does still happen in the foster home. This type of phenomenon does not discriminate based off of environment. But making the call on a small kitten is what nightmares are made of. It's awful. But this is where, that thought and that conversation of ethics comes in real hot. Sometimes you have to make the call to ensure that the little one won't suffer and die in a painful way overnight while you're gone. It's gut-wrenching, but it's also a gift if you want to kind of flip the script and have a think again perspective. That, once you're trained and experienced and able to spot what failure to thrive looks like, or what panleukopenia looks like, or in general, what pain in an animal looks like, and you can't reverse it. You release that kitten or that other animal that might be on topic out of pain. So that's where that ethical philosophy comes in. And I always wonder how humans gained that evolutionary kind of emotional capacity to make these calls and to perform these procedures. It's too big a topic within this one to remotely be able to cover in a meaningful way. I think when I was at the shelter, I would have an existential, ethical, philosophical crisis, once a week. But that's not why we're here today. Other medical issues that garner kind of serious conversation around EUs are parvovirus, neurological disease, distemper. In our case, in the Northwestern tier, we had an outbreak of canine brucellosis, and that's a zoonotic, which we'll talk more about when we get to the letter Z. But some of these medical issues or cases, I should say, are highly contagious and have a high mortality. So medical-based EUs, in all honesty, for me, feel a bit easier to qualify than our next criteria that we'll talk about. It's by no means easier to qualify a medical EU, but you have the tangible data as to why you are arriving at this choice. And you can see it by way of the animal's behavior and what they're putting out, whether that's, whether you're looking at fecal matter, urine, whatever it may be. It's easier to just simply to see it and say like, oh, medically, this makes sense. But when you get into behavioral EUs, which we'll call BEs, this is where we really get into that ethical and ego kind of philosophical policy-laden territory that's really hard to navigate. I think BEs over time have become a little more recognized, but certainly still stigmatized. I believe it's so vital that shelters have a team of department heads who participate in outcome meetings each week, and that they have criteria and policy around these, what should be considered sacred meetings. This is a point in time each week where the humans, with all of their training and experience and knowledge, come together to discuss the livelihood of these creatures who have been flagged. These are the creatures that, especially when we are talking about behavioral EU, that the behavior department and the animal care team have dedicated their time to know these individual creatures and love these individual creatures right off the bat. And I think the most, you know, it's hard. And I think the most common behavioral issue that leads to BEs is aggression. I hope that that's not a huge surprise to anyone, but there are certainly some, same as medical, some automatic BE situations that come into the door. I think one that we really wouldn't waver on with very minimal exception would be a bite to the face of a human or the killing of another dog. So there are certain opportunities to discuss these issues based on environment and context. But a dog that bites, let's say, a child in the face and cause some serious injury is not going to be considered a safe member of our community. Aggression can be so cut and dry, yet so subjective at times. Um, and it's a tough subject to cover when it comes to deciding the adoptability of the animal. This is why it's, again, so important to have that criteria available to help the decision makers remain objective and unemotional, which I can personally attest to the latter as being close to impossible, but not fully impossible. You know, aggression cases are similar in my mind to medical cases. Um, and that happened with me over time because it's somehow for me a little easier to justify a BE choice when there's a serious aggression issue involved. It's the other behavior issues that become very difficult because, again, with medical, you can see it and you have data and you have tests. With aggression, you can see it, you have historical data, and you know, if there's serious aggression going on and the animal's not safe, then yeah, I'm sorry, it's an unrealistic expectation to put on our community members to be able to take care of that animal in a meaningful way where both human and animal can have a good quality of life. So those ones make a little bit more sense to me. In other behaviors, they're definitely more infrequent in my experience to aggression or medical cases when it comes to BEs. But when we start to look at other behavior issues that question quality of life, um, that's where it gets really hard to be objective. And you can define quality of life however you want. I don't think there can be a non-subjective way to define it because it's personal to us as individuals. But what makes for a life not worth living when we look at BEs? It circles back to this idea again of ethics. Who made us in charge of this? Like, how did we as humans become capable of making these choices on behalf of other species? I think one could argue that it's been around for forever. This ability of ours. Once if you've been watching the YouTube, I've been doing sort of a history lesson on animal advocacy and anti-cruelty, and with that, a lot has come up about just sort of our ethical, historical, and evolutionary relationship with pets. So maybe we'll find a better answer at some point there. Who knows? So, anywho, other behaviors that may constitute a decision for a BE could be fear, separation anxiety, and compulsive behaviors. Some separation anxiety and compulsion could lead to a serious self injury within that animal. Primarily, we're looking at dogs. There have been a few cats that have some compulsions that could affect their health and their quality of life, and it more often than not is a little easier to treat with on a pharmaceutical level. So with dogs, it's a little different, and it's fascinating that it is different. But when we would bring cases like that, like separation anxiety, compulsion, or fear type behaviors to discussion, it would be a long discussion meeting. It would be a rough day. I think one story that I could use in his example is this one dog that we had. Um, he had really bad anxiety, and it was generalized. It was separation. It was confinement. He had all the anxieties. He also had some stereotypic behaviors that he would perform because of that. So kennel pacing, spitting in circles, whatever that may be. He was also blind. I can't remember off the top of my head if he was born blind or if it was something that happened later on in his life. Um, but he had this medical, he was sight impaired and had this really intense anxiety. So I caught him one day towards the end of the day climbing his kennel wall, and it's a concrete wall. He wasn't even on the kennel door where there would at least be like grates and paw holds for him to grip onto. He was jumping and trying to release himself from his 12-foot kennel, 12 foot high. And he was falling. He'd get up to the top, lose grip, fall. Get back up, try again, fall. And it was, there's not a word that I can think of that properly demonstrates what I felt witnessing that. Sadness, obviously, but it was deeper than that. The full somatic response I had was utter horror and terror for this animal. We pulled out all the stops for this kiddo, sent him out to a foster to adopt situation that he overall did well at, but the people weren't comfortable with the level of anxiety and with medicating. They had other dogs, which he loved being around other dogs. That could have been a really helpful tool for him. But he was with us for a while. He was deteriorating, especially after they brought him back from the foster situation. So we had all of these variables to discuss quality of life. We discussed transferring him to another shelter to test another adoption pool. We discussed finding a blind dog rescue. Again, when you're looking at rescues and sanctuary, there is criteria that the animal has to meet in order to be considered as a candidate. He was not considered a candidate by multiple sources that I looked into, which then brought us to deciding on a behavioral euthanasia. I think we discussed this dog probably for a month straight in our weekly meetings. And again, because the definition of quality of life is so subjective, as an individual within this realm, if it's a human and we're talking about, a terminal patient, it's a little more cut and dry to the individuals experiencing that with that person who's terminal. But when we're looking at animals and it's something like another behavior issue like anxiety coupled with being impaired by sight, it's hard to define exactly what that QOL is and whether or not this animal has it. So we did euthanize him. And he's a dog that I think about often because in my mind, and we were not unanimous in this decision. We did have to have our OD, I believe, make the call based off of both groups who were either for or not for behavioral euthanasia. And that OD decided for behavioral euthanasia. And it was devastating. The staff obviously were upset. We all loved this dog. And it brought me to, being on the behavior management end of things, you do have to, or you should, be equipped to have conversations with other staff members about your BE choices. And that can sometimes get really personal and really emotional. As I've shared on past episodes, there were times where I would walk through the halls of the shelter and feel like people were looking at me like the Grim Reaper. But in my mind, what I kept telling myself was, we may not have saved this animal in the traditional sense, but we did save him. We saved him by releasing him from this anguish that he was in, because when you looked at it, he was clearly in anguish. He was struggling. He was on medications for behavior. He had tons of enrichment. We decked his kennel out to where we were putting blankets over the top because at some point I was like, I wonder if the overhead lights, even though he's blind, he can still see shadow and light to an extent. And I was like, I think the overhead lights are freaking him out. So we did that and it worked for a little bit. But then he got used to that environment and then started to panic again. So it was this whole process of, one of the very few BEs that we've done that was not aggression related. And again, they are they were, at least in my shelter, very infrequent when we would have that other behavior issue. But outside of sheltering, another example is my own dog, Daffodil. I chose to do a behavior euthanasia with her earlier this year. She did not have any separation anxiety, but she was fearful. And by way of that fearfulness, yeah, had anxiety around life itself. Um, and at this point in time, she started to kind of regress into early behaviors that I saw when I first adopted her. She was severely under socialized. I could say borderline feral, but that's a slippery slope. But she definitely lacked human social experiences to draw from and feel safe. So when she started to regress after the 5 years that I worked so hard with her, that last 6 months, so that last portion of her existence here on Earth was um, heartbreaking, not only to see but also to live with. Um, I'll do another episode strictly on Daffodil at some point when I'm ready. But for those of you listening who may not work in the shelter or may work in the shelter, this is actually for you all. When you're adopting an animal out with behavioral issues that are heavier than normal, that are going to take a lot of management, that are going to take a fairly large upheaval in the human's life in order to accommodate and be guardian to that dog, you're asking for a lot from the human. You're also asking for a lot from the dog or the cat, but the dog in this case. And that's another point of contention when you are deciding to do BEs in these outcome meetings, because at what point does it become ethically an issue of making a behaviorally challenged dog someone else's problem? I know that my dog Daffodil had been adopted out 2 times before I took her home. And the second time she was returned, I couldn't bear to watch her go through that again with someone else who was under the impression that, in Daffodil's case, love would heal all, because that was not the case for her. She did not respond well to love or to our version of what we think love is. Um, Meaning, like, touch was not her favorite thing. She did not love being touched by people. She would recoil, she would tighten up. Um, she and I worked a lot on being comfortable with being touched strictly so that she could get vaccines and get a bath, because she was a Pyrenees, so she had a double coat, like, and be brushed. She actually came to love being brushed. And that was the biggest mode of, touch love language that I could show her. But again, when you're adopting these dogs out as a shelter, and if people bring them back, and then you end up euthanizing because of those behaviors, because it's clear that one adopter couldn't take it, two adopters couldn't do it, three adopter couldn't do it. Yeah, if you want to adopt that dog as the shelter employee, by all means, obviously, go for it. I learned a ton from Daffodil, and I'm so grateful. Also, sometimes the best outcome is release. Sometimes the best outcome is release from this current planet, and from this current body, and from this current mind. Uh, and that was a hard decision for me to come to. It was hard for me, and it still is, to even accept that I loved Daffodil without condition, but she loved me with condition. So learning how to accept that, while all of your other, your friends' dogs are, the fairly typical bomb-proof dogs who show affection, who want to be involved in your life, and then to have a dog that doesn't, is devastating. But again, I learned so much from Daffodil from a professional perspective, as well as from a personal perspective, that I'm eternally grateful. And it was not an easy choice. Again, I want those shelters to keep in mind, like, if you adopt a dog out like this, like Daff, or an aggressive dog out, you are asking this adopter to deeply change their lives in order to care for this creature. That's a big responsibility. That's not to say that the adopter cannot do it. Most adopters prove that they absolutely can. It's just that matter of ethics. When do you choose to do so, and when do you choose to release the animal from its situation. Kind of be able to start quantifying it in those conversations as a behavior manager, as someone assisting in making those calls, and as someone doing the euthanasia, performing the actual process, to help talk to people about why it makes sense and why we came to this choice. And I know anyone out there in sheltering listening right now, you know that there's always a handful of people who really struggle with the choice of BE and will always be the first ones to come to your office saying, I don't agree with this. Why did you do this? What are you doing? And I think being able to really remain objective, which I did not always do a good job of in my position. When I'm met with other people's emotions, I tend to just shut down and also be emotional, which was something I got to learn and grow from within sheltering and got better at as time went on. But you really do want to have this skill set and these tools to be able to know who you're talking to, know their personality as an individual, and provide them with reasoning, and making sure that it is objective and that you do keep the emotional aspect of the choice out of it. Really make sure that you utilize language that is going to be consistent with all the other BE choices that you have to make. So I guess with that said, there's, I think, a lot to be said about that animal shelter counts statistic of, since 2019, EUs have gone down 21%. And it makes me wonder what the future of shelter euthanasia looks like and what the future of sheltering looks like as well. I don't know, but it looks like we're on a good trajectory to being able to manage population and better manage behavioral issues to avoid behavioral euthanasia. And I'm excited to see what we evolve into as time goes on. I also want to take this time to just talk about what you can do as a shelter employee when you are faced on your weekly outcomes meeting, um, to help yourself in a form of self-care, better manage the choices that are made in your shelter, whether you are the one making the choice or the one just facing the outflow of it. So I started to kind of create a ritualized approach around EUs, especially if I were performing them. But even if it was someone else's week to do them, I would ensure that when I got home, I would have some sort of space held for that animal. So I think the best way that I can kind of explain it to you is kind of based off of advice that I gave a Reddit poster um, a couple weeks ago. Uh, so I'll just read, I guess, what I wrote to her, or him. I actually don't know who OP is. Let's see. Let me just find it. I guess I'll just read the original post. Okay, so to end our session, we'll end with this vent that was posted on Reddit. I will not give the name of OP just out of respect. So I'll just read what they said. So the OP said, "I'm part of our shelter's behavior team. And about a month ago, we got in an extra large staffy as part of an ongoing case through our county ACOs. Long story sort of short, he and a couple other dogs attacked a calf, so a baby cow, and he was responsible for removing half the face and 4 inches of tongue of the cow. The owners have already petitioned once to get him back and have been denied, the dog, and are now pursuing it through the court system. So we could have him for a very long time. He's been on my list of dogs to work with to manage his mental health and to muzzle train, but I found out recently that because of the severity of his attack, if the owners aren't granted custody, he will be put down." So logically, she says, he or she, logically, I understand this perfectly. We cannot in good conscience adopt or foster him out. He's very much at risk. Emotionally, I'm struggling very hard with having to work and bond with him every day, potentially for a year, knowing all along how his story will likely end. The big trigger for this came when I realized that I was tasked with muzzle training so that he'll be safer for euthanasia when the time comes. I feel like I'm training him for his death. Today we worked on sustaining eye contact with a watch me command, and I broke. Something about looking him in the eye and knowing what he doesn't destroys me. Again, I know mentally that this is a shit situation for everyone involved. I guess I'm just looking for advice on how to compartmentalize or detach the emotions. Any advice would be great. Thanks for listening. So that was the OP's original, that was the post. And that one just got me good because we've had similar situations at our shelter. And then you're waiting on the legal system before you can give this animal any sort of an outcome, whether it's adoption or euthanasia. And it sucks because cases like this are going to be pushed. They're not going to be priority for the legal system within your county. There's, people killing people or dealing copious amounts of drugs, and that's going to take precedent. So I'll read to you my response, and hopefully this will help anyone else in this behavioral position, or even anyone else just sort of maybe grappling with euthanizing their pet who's getting old or is kind of ready or is a BE. So this was my response. I said, "Oh man, this is a tough one. Behavior manager here, and know that I'm with you in the fields on this. I also have my certified euthanasia tech license and am often tasked with these situations, followed by being the one to inject. Something I tell myself when in the mud like this is, you're the most important part of his journey right now." I flipped the script a bit and remind myself that it's an honor to be the one with all the love and compassion for this dog, all while being his usher to the end of his life. For some reason, that puts me in a better mindset to offer him all I can. I also recommended that if you have a higher power, universally, you speak to. I also chat with them. In my case, it's my spirit guides and loved ones on the other side, and I ask that they assist with his spiritual comforts leading up to his point of passing as well. Again, these are mindsets and ritualized actions I take to protect myself from imminent breakdowns, and it helps me arrive at the shelter every day with a bit of lightness in my actions. I guess the bottom line is you, or we, choose a line of work that opens us up to the opportunity to grow and become more comfortable with death and grief. I use this as a reminder of my emotional strength, and I honor that. Then I did an edit, and I said, sometimes the best thing is to not detach. Rather, go right through the emotions and share that space with that amazing creature. I also noted that I do spoil them with beef burritos from Taco Bell near the end, and whatever else they could possibly want. So I don't know if that's remotely helpful for anyone to kind of hear, I guess, what my approach is, and it does for me come from a more spiritual realm. I think there is room to create ritual or practices around euthanasia and shelters, whether you take an approach and kind of pull from the fear-free methods of handling and create your own kind of fear-free euthanasia protocol. I haven't seen them do a fear-free euthanasia program yet, but I hope that they do. So I think pulling from like fear-free intake and then fear-free vet med handling and kind of creating your own system is something you could do that would be sort of like a ritual. I think that having the tools in the room with you that you need to be okay with what's happening can also help the animal be okay-ish with what's happening. I think it's really important that you take a second before you even go to get the animal that you are about to euthanize to be very calm. Kind of center yourself. If you go in nervous and scared or stressed or sad, the dog will feel that and the cat will feel that. So going in as calm as you can. And that also helps you center yourself for the actual process. I think that, again, whether you are religious or not, whether you're spiritual or not, having something that feels real and meaningful to you around this topic is really important. So for me, again, it's that more spiritual realm, I always would have a couple crystals with me. I would have my Palo Santo spray because I wasn't about to light anything in the building. But um, those are things that I would do. And then I would come home after the fact and light a candle for the animals or the animal that I had to euthanize that week. And yeah, I would just talk to what I qualify as my spirit guides, and just ask that they help carry the animal on with their journey. I think my mantra that I would say out loud to every animal was safe journey as they were going. And it brought me a little bit of comfort. I didn't always do that. And on the days that I didn't have my kind of mindset of ritual around the process, is when they would affect me in a deeper, more traumatic and dangerous level to where it would contribute to that compassion fatigue that I talked about a few weeks ago. So making sure that you practice that as often as you can. I think euthanasia in shelters, like I said earlier, can be some sort of a gift depending on how you want to perceive it. So keep that in mind as you continue on in your career or as you continue on in making a choice for your own pet that you are guardian to. Um, when it is their time, set them free and know that uh, the capability that you obtained from having that relationship with this animal, no matter how long or short, um, only shows you just how capable of love that you are. And I think that's something very beautiful. I think working in sheltering had primed me very well for dealing with my own grief that has presented itself in my life, as it will for all of ours. But I digress. That is today's episode on euthanasia in the shelters. We covered a lot of groundwork here today. I hope that when you turn the podcast off, you go take a walk, put your feet in the grass, take a bath, do a cartwheel, work out, drink some tea, drink a glass of wine, whatever you need to, in a relatively healthy way, kind of absorb and digest what I talked about today. Thank you, as always, for listening. And yeah, hopefully this gave some people some food for thought and some insight on what it really looks like when you are euthanizing in a shelter. As always, remember that humans are animals too. And just because we have a unique cognitive ability to move and function in this world does not entitle us to be assholes. So don't be mean. Takes a bit more energy to be nice, but it feels so much better. All right, you guys, have a great week. Bye-bye.